Okay, so thank you for joining me on your Tuesday afternoon, or depending on where you are, depending on the time. Um, this is our last webinar for the year. We usually do a monthly webinar once a month, and this was one we felt like that we would kind of look at some of the ag trends, some of the things you need to think about. And then there's been a lot of questions about one area of labor and labor shortages, and I thought I might share some really interesting information that you can also share with others this coming year with everything that's going on. So welcome and thanks for joining. So I like this picture because sometimes you may think, what on earth does ag trends have to do with my job in migrant ed? Maybe you're an instructor, maybe you're a recruiter. Agriculture, the one thing that is constant is that there is always change, and that change directly impacts why workers come, where they go to, what they do. And so it's really important for us to be aware of those kind of factors. It also impacts us in our personal lives with prices of things and why things go up and down. And so I wanted to just give some real good information that hopefully will give you kind of talking points as you're talking to people in the community, as you kind of understand what's happening currently in agriculture. So there's an interesting article right here that was put out, I'm trying to see, by Newsweek in March. It says between 2017 and 2022, and this is from the Ag Census, the US saw a reduction of farms by 141,000 less farms, with a total decline of 7%. So that's a lot. I feel like the more we do these ag trends, the more we see that there's a lot of really bad news. There's not a whole ton of really bright spots, and it's really important for us to really be aware of what's going on. So the American Farm Bureau Federation president, Zippy Duvall, when after the ag census has come out and they were looking at that, he says, we're losing farms in America at a rapid pace, and there's no question that our broken workforce system is partly to blame. And then the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis had come out with a report that really showed the challenges that farms were having in finding labor, and that they were seeing a decrease of migrant workers and an aging workforce and in what they called the ninth district, which is the Midwest and upper Midwest. And so if you look at the first paragraph, it talks about that there were losses all over the place with workers in a lot of places, Texas, Oklahoma, Missouri, a bunch of them. But then they also specifically mention a lot of the Midwest and upper Midwest, that there just wasn't the movement that they had for ag workers. And they expected that the labor shortage has really caused a lot worse of a situation in a lot of these places. So a few things that are really impacting it, kind of if you were taking the notebook of what's happening in ag right now. Climate change is directly infecting a lot of places, and the extreme weather, such as droughts, wildfires, causes damage to both crops and livestock. And in the past, people would say, well, climate change is going to be a distant threat. It'll be something we're going to see in the future. We're seeing a lot of really erratic weather in a lot of places. We're seeing a lot of impacts across the globe. And like it says here, rising temperatures. We saw this year in the summer, erratic rainfall patterns. We're seeing that across the country as drought is affecting different areas. Extreme weather events. We just saw that in North Carolina just a little bit ago. Just how much water you're getting from hurricanes and places that are so inland that they used to not be affected. All of this is disrupting food production and also threatens food security, and it can really impact a lot of people. So I need to pull the message, the chat box down so I can see. So this kind of, you can see the little squeezed piggy there. This really causes a lot of economic pressures, especially on farmers. Farmers are facing operational costs. The cost to do business is a lot more, labor shortages, and a lot of market volatility on the commodities. Like something might have been worth a lot more, and then all of a sudden they're getting way less for it, and then more debt. So as if your operation is just barely making it and you need to borrow more, we're seeing a lot more debt in that sector. So input costs, that's kind of farmer lingo as far as the cost of the things that you need to be able to kind of run your farm. So example of fertilizers has continued to increase globally, and it's expected that cost of fertilizers is expected to continue. We have fertilizer that's gone up, fuel that's gone up, machinery. We've seen that there's not been enough machinery in a lot of places. The price of essential things that they need to just farm, everything from seeds to Water in some areas is really putting immense pressure on farmers, and like it says over and over, really threatening that food security worldwide, because we're not the only ones that are seeing these kind of changes. It's not just a US thing. Now, labor shortages, I'm going to go pretty in depth in that today to give you the big picture. There are fewer workers in the US labor force than in 2020, and it makes it difficult for more employers to run operations. So the labor shortage was something that I feel like people really felt like was an ag problem for a long time, but now they're seeing that it's not just an ag problem, it's across the board. So we're seeing young workers continuing to migrate to urban areas. There's also an aging farm workforce. And it says here, shortages were especially pronounced in seasonal labor, essential for planting, harvesting, and processing. With adequate labor, productivity and efficiency can be improved. So labor is a real issue to make sure that we have enough people. Then we have supply chain issues. A lot of this started with COVID. We had equipment shortages and shipping disruptions, and a lot of those, not all of those have been fixed so far. So it says here, lack of agriculture equipment and shipment poses a major threat to global food production. Shortages of semiconductors, steel, and other materials have led to production slowdowns and empty shelves at agriculture equipment dealerships. Farmers struggle to find essential machinery like tractors, harvesters, and irrigation systems, and then that delays planting and harvesting schedules. So for a while too, there's been a big fight of whether farmers, if you had a John Deere tractor, whether you could fix it yourself or whether you had to take it to a dealership. Well, sometimes they might have taken it to get it fixed, but the particular piece of equipment that you need to get fixed is not available, and so you're just waiting until you can have that. So there's a lot of bottlenecks, a lot of delays, a lot of things that got lost and that got stuck, and so that directly has also impacted. Some of the things that have gotten better is there's a lot more smart technologies. They've really made some really good leaps with the types of sensors. One of the things that's been a major concern, especially out west, I'm in the East Coast, so I think some of us in the East Coast are not as aware of the water challenges that the West Coast has. Now they have a lot more tools that you can kind of monitor soil moisture, temperature, crop health, and they can do a lot more smart technology kind of watering, so they're not wasting any water. More drones, more harvesters. We've seen like weeders that actually are drones that they can kind of zap different weeds, and a lot of technology that didn't exist. Last week I was at the National Ag Employers Conference, and they had a guy that his job, he has a business to make these robots. And so he was working specifically with tomato harvesters, with different harvesters, where because they have more of a shortage of labor, they're trying to figure out what jobs could be done by robotics, that you still need workers, and robotics are still very expensive, but what can you do to kind of ease? And so they had mentioned this little conveyor belt system that they had made for this particular farm, that they were able to save 60 worker spots for that. And they had a real shortage of workers, so they're able to retrain and use the other workers in the places that they needed the most. So it says here, digital agriculture transcends traditional practices. These tools offer precise monitoring and management of crops, streamlining operations, and really being able to optimize use. Now, they're not cheap. That's the thing. You have to have, the farm has to be, we're seeing a lot of larger farms use these. I have a colleague out in California that works with UC Davis, and he was talking about in Washington that they had some technology that the apple growers were wanting to use, but that then the farm workers that had been working in this industry for a long time were really uncomfortable with the use of that. And so they were trying to figure out how to get the children of the farm workers to be able to help train their moms and dads on how to use these different iPads or things that were controlling these different machines. And so sometimes they may have a tool that's ready for a population, but they're not quite ready to use it based on their comfortability with that. So I'm going to switch over and talk a lot about labor. And I think this is important because I'm not sure what next year, how everything's going to look when we're trying to reach out to families or to farmers. And I think it's really important for us to understand specific challenges and the value of workers, no matter where they're from. And I wanted to really kind of share some information that I think hopefully will be insightful for people. I know it was for me. I just may be geeky enough about this that I like this, and you guys hopefully it'll be helpful anyway. So it says here, there are still more job openings than unemployed workers right now. So I'm going to go through some series of charts and information, and I'm going to send you a link to a really well done report that just came out recently about labor shortages and what's happening across the country. So starting out here, it says, of all the job openings that we have, We have plenty of job openings. You see that at 2022 there was tons of job openings, and it's gone down a little bit, but we're not down to where we were back in 2019. But the job openings per unemployed worker, so for every unemployed worker, there's almost a job and a half that's available for them that's not yet been filled. And so in March of this year, 30%, 37% of all small businesses reported job openings that they could not fill. So that's 37%. That's a good amount. So that actually was the lowest level since January 2021. So inflation and labor continue to dominate small business concerns, with 25% of owners citing inflation as their single greatest concern, 18% citing labor, and 10% citing labor costs. So this is across the board. This is not just agriculture, this is everything. So compared to pre-pandemic employment rates, 2.3 million fewer people are working today. So before COVID and after, we've got 2.3 million less that are working. So it says here, the labor shortage is not going to go away. And sometimes some of the proposals that are being touted right now, many people are saying it's going to make it much worse. So I want to explain why. And it says here, the US is simply not producing enough workers to satisfy the needs of the employers. So it's not a new issue. We noticed back in 2019, they were noticing that they needed a lot more workers in trucking, nursing, and commercial aviation. And when the virus spread during COVID, that problem continued, and then it got worse. But then there were a lot of changes that were made with what was happening specifically with workers and how people were working during that time. And so there is a really interesting report called The Rising Storm. I'm going to go share where you can find it online. And let me just share what it looks like. And I'll go ahead and drop it in the chat box, so you can see that. Okay, so if I can. This is done by Lightcast, and they analyze all sorts of labor statistics from all over the world. And they just came out with this report just a little bit ago. And for me, I find it fascinating. So I'm going to share a little bit of the insights from this. So what I'm going to be sharing now is directly from the report. There's a lot more information that you can get more background on it. But I'm just going to share the highlights that I think make sense for all of us in the work that we do. So when I was with the National Ag Employers last week, one of the things that I did was present to them a little bit about this particular issue, and then from the perspective of the employer, that if we don't know what's causing the labor shortage, we may need to adapt what we're doing. And that can go for us too if we're trying to hire recruiters or staff. It says workforce strategies need to adapt, but if you don't know what changes lie in store, you really don't know what changes to make in response. And so they're warning, saying the news is not good. The most acute shortages of workers will arrive under a decade. So they're saying it's tight right now, but it's going to get way worse in the next 5 years, which will explain why. And the industries hardest hit are some of the things that are most really needing all over the place, everything from healthcare and construction. We already know that ag has this, but we're seeing this in a lot more areas. So they believe that worker shortages can be solved by 4 different ways. One is you develop local workforces. So one of the things I always find fascinating is a lot of our high school students, we usually put them in one career path. Hey guys, you need to go to college. And that's what we say over and over and over. And sometimes ag industries in that same area are saying, I have these jobs and no one's ever applying, but nobody's reaching out to that potential labor force and talking to those kids when they're trying to make decisions about what they want to do in the future. So they talk about how you develop that local workforce. There's the idea of globalization. We're tied. I mean, if you go to the grocery store now, half of the stuff that you're going to get in your fruit and vegetable aisle were not produced in the United States. They came from all over the world. And so we're very connected. We may grow so many potatoes in Idaho and ship them to another country, and then we ship almost the same amount back into our country. So it's very complex. And a lot of times it's all based off the middle person who's buying for different grocery stores. They're trying to get the best rate, the cheapest tomato, and so it just depends on where they're getting it from that global market. There's automation and immigration. So those are the 4 areas: developing that local workforce, globalization, automation, and immigration. And so they suggest that each of industry will have to look at what their needs are and figure out what balance of those 4 areas they're going to really need to improve that number of workers that are available. So they talk about the unprecedented turbulence that we've seen since since 2020. There was the overheated pressure of 2022 and 2023, which created record highs in job openings and then also quits, people leaving and going somewhere else. It led to supply chain shortages. There was inflation, and they say this is not a one-time thing. This is a precursor. They called it the rising storm. This is a precursor of what's to come. So making sense of this, I don't know if you can see this very well. I think this is very interesting to think about. It says, number one, takeaways, the baby boomers, so that shaped every institution they touched. So these are people born between 1946 and 1964. So my parents are in that group. This is an enormous cohort of 76 million Americans that are now between 60 and 78 years old. So we have never had that big of a generation since. 76 million Americans, and the youngest of all of them are 60 right now. And they are retiring in droves from the labor market that they built. And they mentioned that when all of these baby boomers, and some of you that are listening are in that group, and I don't really like all the different names, but I'll just refer to them as that so you know what group it is. When they started working, it was the same time that more women entered the workforce. So there was a huge amount of workers at this time. So it produced a very competitive labor market, which employers really held the upper hand. So if I'm an employer and I have 56 different applications coming in for 2 jobs, I can be very choosy. So workers are highly motivated. They want to really set themselves apart. So they work to get new credentials. They're willing to move anywhere in the country. They make as many sacrifices as they can to try to be competitive, and they're competing against everybody else for these jobs. And so it says to understand what was happening, you can see here the birth rate in 1947, and then it's continued to go down since. And so we're not, let me see if there's any more. Okay, let's see. There's a comment. I'll look at that in just a second. We haven't really come back from that. And so they were born during this time, and the birth rate really has continued to go down. So there's not another generation right behind of that size that is entering the workforce. And then while you have all of females entering the workforce at the same time, by the mid 1990s, that's 60% that really, and so we're pretty similar to that right now. We're a little bit under, pretty close to it. So this to me was super fascinating. So if you were a young adult between the 1970s and 80s, you are entering in a workforce with not enough jobs to go around. Super tight competition, you're looking for work, and the unemployment rate does not drop. It never drops below 5%. Employers are suddenly able to take their pick from all of these highly skilled, ready-to-work applicants. So higher education is a huge thing that sets you apart. College enrollment soared, and in a highly competitive landscape, this could be a way that you could kind of set yourselves apart. Housing was abundant and not as it is now, was super expensive in some places, which means people were ready to pick up and go wherever that job was. It says for example, Silicon Valley's population grew alongside residential construction by 700,000 from 1980 to 2000. Since 2000, it has only grown 10%, less than 300,000. So housing starts later on to become a real issue, but it's not at this time. So also at this time, between 1960 and 1980, as people were working so much and really focusing on that, the divorce rate begins to skyrocket. And so you can see that we continue to have it lower and lower and lower, and there are way less people getting married now than there used to be, which means there's also less babies. And so it says, while pregnancy and childcare would be hindrances to parents hoping to advance in the workforce, this also connected to the population spike above. The same advances that allowed for the huge population gains during the baby boom now worked in the opposite direction. The skyrocketing population led to doomsday predictions of resource shortages, cultural shift, etc. But you see that the mindset's a little bit different. At the same time, over and over and over, people are saying, hey, I do not need immigrants to steal jobs. The competition is so tight that the last thing they want is anyone else that's really, trying to compete for these same jobs. It says here, my highest political priorities are creating jobs and decreasing employment. Anything that threatens job growth, so we're needing more and more jobs like imported goods, automation, regulation, it really faces fierce opposition during this time. So on other things that create jobs, subsidies, low taxes, new industries are welcomed. At the turn of the millennium, it says here, I need to look out for number one more than I can prioritize company loyalty. So something happens when the boomers are at the peak of their careers. Many companies just go through layoffs. Employees lost confidence in their long-term prospects. When shareholders wanted businesses to cut costs and maximize profitable returns, the companies no longer offered this stability. And so then people began to switch all over the place. So an interesting statistic here, as a percentage, older generations are least likely to say immigrants strengthen the community. So right now, 76% of people born after 1980 believe that they are strengthening the country. Only 60% of those born between 1965 to 1980, 48% those born between 1946 and 1964, and 41% of 1928 and 1945. But this goes directly back to the experience that they had in the workforce while they were out. Same thing with hiring managers. They're able to say, hey, I have all these people. I remember early on when I was working with Migrant Ed in like early 2000s, we would have lots of applications for certain types of jobs, where later on that was really hard to find. So the employer is still thinking, hey, I can limit it. I can really make sure that they're as trained as possible. I can really look at how much I want to pay, and I've got more flexibility. But things have really changed for the employers now. So some interesting takeaways that they highlighted were that the baby boomers were this huge demographic, but the new younger workers that are coming in right now are looking very different at their lives and their careers than the previous generations before. They also see very limited labor force participation for working age men, and it continues to fall. And I'll explain that. And because of that, there's a lot more vacancies. And they really believe that this is, remember that 5 years, those boomers that are 60, with that many of them that are leaving in 5 years, if they retire at 65, then that really can be a challenge for replacing that group. So they have something that they call the labor force participation rate. And so you can see here that before, in 2018, 63% of all people that could work were working. And now it's gone down since then. The total adult population not in the labor force, it went way up during COVID and it's gone down. But there's still plenty of people that were in there before. Now, there's also a lot that are retiring, but this labor participation rate has gone down. So here is the workup of our current labor market of people that are all working. So we've got the largest group now being millennials born between 1981 to 2000. And then you've got Gen X is there, and then Gen Z, and then our baby boomers, and then a few of those that were born between 1928 and 1945. So this just kind of lets you be able to see that. So they project, Department of Labor says between 2024 to 2032, the US population growth will outpace labor force nearly 8-1. So because we have these plenty of workers that are worker age but not working, or people retired, we're going to have, here's the growth, but we're only expecting 2.3 million is the change of the number of people working. So what that means is in 1954, for example, for every one that was considered an older population that was not working, there were 5.8 workers that were out in the labor field working. So if you think about it, you know, our country needs all of these specific things. These were all being produced by that 5.8, workers. We are now down to, they're projecting, right now we're at 2.9, and they're projecting with the way our current labor market is, a number of people in the projections, that it's going to continue to go down. And that causes a real big problem in being able to create enough goods to be able to support the population. Plus, as you get people that are way older and they're needing more healthcare and more support, you're just not going to have that. The other thing that we've seen is the shifts of the way that people do things. And so a growing number of young adults are living with parents. So you can kind of see here that how that has kind of changed over time. And those that are between 18 to 24, it's actually, it looks like there's kind of some that are younger. You can see kind of the difference over time, but then you can see those that are between 25 to 34, we have 20% of men, and between 25 and 34, you can see less of women that are still living with parents. Labor participation for prime age men has fallen. This is between the ages of 25 to 54. It has continues to fall down, and you can see Labor force participation for men aged 25 to 54 fell sharply as soon as millennials reached that age range. So it kind of goes down, and then you can see it continues. What that means, why is that? They had some kind of disturbing statistics here. It says the total labor market between substance addiction and current incarceration, a total of 4.6 million Americans are out of the labor force. So these can be all different ages. The majority of these are prime age men. The demographic that many occupations that right now have critical labor shortages are directly impacted. We have over 100,000 overdose deaths, 70% of those from opioids. 1 in 4 were in construction or what they call extraction occupations. 2.7 million people are out of the labor force due to addiction, 1.2 due to opioids, and 232 million people missed work due to alcohol alone, the equivalent of 112,000 full-time workers missing an entire year. So 1.9 million people are behind bars. 1 in 5 are because of a drug offense. 9% of all men in the United States will serve time behind bars in their lifetime. And there are 1.4 million prime age men that are behind bars right now. So really an interesting, something to really think about for your high school kids, that you're kind of letting them, giving them some ideas and options. Right now, these are the skilled trades that rely on a workforce that's over 90% male. All of these have not enough workers in it. Plumbers, 98% male. Automotive technicians, 98% male. Carpenters, highway maintenance workers, electricians, construction operators, line installers. So all of these industries right now are really, really seeing a shortage, and they're seeing a shortage related to a lot of different reasons. But this is still primarily 90% male in all of these industries. So the labor force is growing in ways that are misaligned with demand. So we have growth with bachelor's degrees, but the growth without bachelor's degrees, there isn't growth in that area. And the real challenge is these are the areas where they're needing a lot of workers. And so these 10 occupations right here are the highest number of annual job openings. So these guys cannot find the workers that they need, and these are the ones that they're, this whole group that they're really needing. So it says comparing our current, what does this have to do with migrant ed? I think it's really important for the conversations that we have as we go forward, really being able to explain what's going on. Let's say you show up at a farm and they're really not thinking that, it's important for us to have workers that are, as soon as you say the name of the program, they get really upset. It's really important for you to understand what is happening and how you can explain, hey, we're having worker shortages and everything. Thank goodness we still have people that are, picking up and moving across the country to work with agriculture. So it says comparing future workforce projections to present market needs. We're already having the demand that dwarfs the supply. The math is not adding up. So they're suggesting that female participation in immigration will be absolutely crucial for meeting workforce needs, because automation, even though there is a lot of automation, it's still years away from being economical and then being practical for most businesses. And then the real challenge related is, as boomer retirements and declining birth rates squeeze that working population on both ends, the US will face a deficit of millions of workers before the end of the decade. So kind of interesting, they expect just a growth of 6.4 million right here. And then they have people that have 4-year degrees, and then they said 3.8 million of the growth is expected to be 65 and older. So there's still some real challenges there. If they decide to retire earlier, then you're going to lose that. But then there's a lot of job openings in food industry, community service, construction, home improvement, and there's not a huge growth of that group that already they're having a hard time filling. So here's an example of current jobs right now that are filled. How many of these are filled by people that are at or near retirement age? So you can look at the number of home health and personal care aides, over 1 million. Laborers and material movers, over 1 million. All of these are just very close. They're 55 and up. We know that our farmers, that's something across the country that they're, on average, they're above 55. So you can see all of these different industries with people near retirement age. And then the idea that foreign-born workers make up a large share of many crucial industries. So Sometimes as we're out and about, I know when I go recruiting, I worked for many years in the state of Tennessee. As I would go out and visit a farm, sometimes they would give me this big spiel about how they wished. I had to be very careful what words I said, and just said, hey, we work with families that have moved in the last 3 years that work in agriculture. And they would say, well, are they from Mexico, or they're from this? And I could say they can be from anywhere. And sometimes they would give me this big rant about how they wish that people weren't taking jobs and all of these things. And now it makes a lot of sense, depending on the experience that that person has had at different points in their life, of their views of different things. But right here it shows how foreign-born workers are really important in many, many, many different industries. And so construction, 29%, other services, 23%, professional and business services, 21%. One that I found really interesting is health. So many of our doctors across the country are from other countries. Agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting, 20%. Transportation, utilities, manufacturing. We really depend on workers coming from all over, and it's really crucial for all of our good. So I'm going to look and see what's here. There was a comment that says, I've noticed a significant turnover among out-of-school youth leaving farms here in Erie without much notice. When I ask why, they often cite the long hours and poor living conditions as the main reasons. Many of the younger workers in particular seem to aspire for more for themselves. They view agriculture work as a temporary stepping stone, a way to get there and start building a better future. As a result, they aren't staying on the farms for very long. That was something interesting too when we talked to H2A employers, that they're saying that they didn't always want the younger workers because they wanted workers that specifically had families and had responsibilities because they would stay longer. And so I think younger generation, the way they're working is different. We have a lot of different things coming to play. Now, I noticed somebody raise their hand. If you raise your hand, like I said, you have to put your comment in the chat box and we'll answer there. Okay, so just really important when it says other services, so it's anything that's not listed on these on here that they have. So this is all from the Census Bureau. So interesting here, it says industries across the labor market employ millions of foreign-born workers. So this is the crazy thing. You can listen, turn your news on, and it can talk about how people are taking all these jobs. You can go out to the ag. Personally, myself, in all the years that I visited a ton of farms. I've never seen a line of employees begging for jobs there. I've never seen that. So we have a narrative that I think it's really important that we are able to share in our communities what's happening in those conversations. Regardless of whatever side of the aisle you're on, it doesn't matter. We need workers. We have shortages, not just in ag, we have shortages across the board. So industries that here employ, you can see all of these. Without foreign-born workers, the U.S. labor force would have shrunk over the last 5 years. So if you can kind of see what this looks like, here's the change in total labor force. Here's the change in foreign-born labor force. Here's the change in U.S.-born labor force. So because the U.S.-born labor force declined, 102% of labor force growth came from immigrants. Really interesting to think about. So without immigration, working age people will start to disappear from before the U.S. labor force. So I don't have it on the slides, but in this particular report, it talks about Japan. And Japan is years ahead of having labor shortages and not being able to replace themselves as a population. And it talks about all the different things that they've done over the years and how concerned they are about just society in general being able to have what they need without being very deliberate about the number of people that they need to be able to come and kind of help them. So you can see here, this is where it is without immigration. You can see the difference. So graph represents population change if 65-year-olds workforce exodus are subtracted from 16-year-olds workforce entrance. And so that's another thing. We have a whole bunch of those jobs that we were showing earlier that have these holes. Many of our youth are not starting working until they're 21 or 22. So you have these 16, 17, 18, 19-year-olds jobs that used to be filled by that are not being filled. So they're seeing that it's taking longer for people to enter the workforce because of the way things are done. They also talked about how baby boomers, for example, made so much money that many millennials are inheriting that. And so they'll become one of the richest generations ever because they're inheriting baby boomers money from, and so that also is an incentive that sometimes people are not as incentivized to go work. So let's see. Okay, so another thing is the US fertility rate fell dramatically after the baby boom, and it stayed below replacement level for decades. So this is really interesting because you think, okay, people are always saying, oh, the population's going to explode and there's going to be this. This is where we are. You see this little line that says replacement rate, and you can see where we are now. Yeah, and if you don't believe anything I'm saying, you can Google it, you can check it, you can fact check it. All of this, you'll be able to see that these things, there are plenty of statistics really being able to show. So these next few slides kind of talk about the employer and the employee's perspective. Again, these are important talking points, important things that you can share, important things for us to understand what's going on. So labor force mobility has reached record lows. So people moving for jobs because inflated prices have led to a collapse in home affordability. We actually have one of our states where they're seeing that people are trying to get way in advance to get either to get housing or to get a job first, because the housing is so hard to get that they don't want to come unless they have the job, or they want to go way in advance and make sure they can get the housing and then try to find the job. So people cannot move and are not they don't expect to just pick up and look for opportunities all over. So when I was talking to the ag employers, we were thinking about what a wonderful thing it is that there are still plenty of people that are willing to pick up and move for ag, because in many other jobs that's not happening. So businesses can no longer rely on workers that are going to come to them, and workers and employers should focus on local opportunities, especially where there's remote work and automation. So this is in general. And so people still move for ag. We're seeing that, but it also is much more challenging than it used to. They talk about the way workers in general think about their job related to the cost of to their family or the benefit to their family. So it says a declining birth rate is exacerbating the labor force challenge, and although a rising one would help alleviate some of these challenges in the long term, the growth would potentially come at a cost to women's labor force participation. So they're suggesting that employers should prioritize childcare and other flexible options for working moms to really take advantage of having women in the workforce. Those that say over and over, I do not want immigrants coming to steal jobs. Without enough US-born Americans working, the only other source of new talent is immigration. In the same report, it talks about how we're not the only ones with labor shortages. And right now we may be saying, hey, we need to make sure nobody comes in. Well, there may come a time where other places are saying, hey, we need these workers, come to us, and providing those opportunities. And we can't always think we have the luxury of people always wanting to come. So they say roughly 1.5 million immigrants will be needed every year for the next 8 to 10 years to offset the declining workforce, enough to support the current economy about how it is right now. Very fascinating here, where people's ideas, where still we hear that, the idea of creating jobs and decreasing unemployment. They say during the time of the baby boomers, the labor market talent was abundant, but now talent is scarce. Many people, if they're good with it, they already have jobs. Low unemployment means low availability of people to fill important jobs. The assumption that the labor surplus will persist is more than outdated. It's dangerous. So saying you can't just assume like, hey, we'll always have plenty of workers. So it was interesting here. They say policies that create jobs will not benefit the market as a whole if they take workers from other critical industries. So governments, they're saying they actually have to start paying attention to what they have, what talent, what availability. And without increased growth in that working age population, they call it a zero-sum game, meaning that maybe in my area, I need a couple of recruiters. Well, then I might take them from Kentucky, and Kentucky is then out those two. They're not having a replacement for that. So if one employer adds workers, it will come at the expense of other employers. Competition has historically been economically beneficial, but now there are risks. Maybe adding new office jobs might not be wise if it leaves areas without essential jobs like police, firefighters, food service, things like that. So they're mentioning the idea of job allocation, how important it is to kind of figure out what is needed and where those can be. Employers now need to be a lot more open about, keeping track of anyone that applies and checking back and be more open-minded. And the idea of not always expecting, maybe you need someone to know how to do specific tasks, and you're saying, I'm going to wait till I find the person, where they're saying employers may need to figure out how to get that person ready and be willing to pay for that kind of training for that person, rather than continuing to look for somebody that they can't find. So maybe you've got to take the current staff that you have and uptrain them so that they can do other things. It says, we used to think, hey, we got all these applicants, I'm just going to screen out as many as possible. Where now they're saying hiring managers willing to revisit the mindset and use technology and maybe an applicant tracking system to kind of see the best person that, be able to pay attention to those applicants, screen them out, but then also see if you need to reach out to them later. Then there's the idea of pay. In the past, they'd say we can pay whatever we want. If the worker doesn't like it, they can go somewhere else. Now it's trying to figure out strategically what the pay is, so that you're not playing below market pay. We see this in Migrant Ed, for example. If you have a job that doesn't have any real security, that it's just, hey, we're going to hire for the summer, it's a 4-month job, you're going to get a different type of applicant than if this is something that they can do year round. And so trying to figure out how you can actually hold on to those that you need if it makes sense. It says benchmarking industry and regional salary rates is crucial for every role in order to ensure workers, both candidates and longtime employees, are adequately compensated before they look for jobs elsewhere. So I've seen this with some Migrant Ed programs where people that have been there 10, 15 years started at a way lower pay rate, and they're at a certain point, and the people that are starting right then are at that same point. And so people can get really, that can be a real challenge to figure out how to keep everybody happy. So that was a ton of information. And I hope that you can see the relevance. There was a question, what will happen if the immigration labor force after the mass deportation, if that happens? I think that there's if you guys could kind of pay attention to all of the different news articles, people are starting to say, hey, labor is a concern. And so it should be, I mean, this is something that I think it's really important that when you're out doing the work that you do and you're talking to different people, that you're able to share resources that can show what's actually happening in the community, and then the value of workers wherever they're from and how important that is. So we want to make sure that is one of the largest challenges that ag employers are having right now, and it's one of the biggest changes that we're seeing, that it just kind of gets a little bit worse. And so we want to make sure that you're able to kind of see. So there are always some, okay, so yeah, Raquel, there was a shift just a little bit the other day that Dreamers might have opportunities that a couple months ago we weren't sure if that was going to happen. So just try to stay very informed, pay attention to whatever you can. But I felt like the report, if you get a chance to read it, there's a ton more information in there. For me, it was phenomenal because it really made a lot of sense. And then you can fact check all of those things and be able to see. But it makes, I mean, if you just look at the amount of baby boomers that are retiring, that's a huge loss of a brain trust of all the people that we're not replacing. And so we're going to need more workers for that. There's questions here. Yeah, there's a lot of possible changes. We're not sure exactly what's going to happen. I'm going to stop recording.